You don't have the right to sit here. This is my son's house, not yours." The words were spoken very lightly. No shouting, no anger, but they made me freeze in place, my hand still holding a glass of water I hadn't had the chance to drink. I looked around the room, at the sofa set I had paid for in installments, at the ceiling light I had installed with my own hands, then back at the woman who had just said that to me, as if I were someone who didn't belong. I used to think that if a father did enough, sacrificed long enough, then one day he would earn a seat in his own child's family. But that night, I realized there are things you can't buy with money, and things you can't keep through silence. Before I continue with what happened after that sentence, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening to this story right now? In your living room, in your car, or on a quiet evening when it's just you? If you've ever felt pushed out of your own family, leave me a comment and tell me where you're listening from. And if you feel this story is worth hearing, please tap like and subscribe. Because what happened next, no one in that room could have predicted. My name is Michael. I am 63 years old, widowed for 8 years, and I live alone in a small house in the northern suburbs of Oregon. I retired early because my heart could no longer handle long shifts, and because the doctor told me I had pushed my body past its limit. I nodded and smiled it off. The truth is, I've been used to overworking myself for a long time, not just at my job. After my wife passed away, I lived quietly. Up early, make coffee, read the local paper, a simple lunch, an afternoon walk around the neighborhood. The neighbors greeted me politely, close enough to know each other's names, far enough not to ask too much. That life wasn't bad. It just lacked human voices. The dinner invitation came from my son, Daniel, on a Thursday afternoon. He kept it brief, said his wife wanted a cozy family dinner, that it had been a while since I'd stopped by. His tone wasn't excited, but it wasn't reluctant either. I listened and agreed, because I always agree to invitations like that. I chose a light blue dress shirt, the one I wore to his graduation ceremony. I brought a bottle of California wine, not expensive but respectable. Before leaving, I stood in front of the mirror a little longer than usual, straightened my collar, and told myself it was just dinner. My son's house is in a newer development, gently curving roads, neatly trimmed lawns, young trees planted in straight lines. I had stood there years ago on a sunny afternoon when the house was still just a wooden frame. I remembered telling him the area was quiet, good for raising a family. I remembered signing a few papers, not reading them too carefully, because at the time I trusted that my son knew what he was doing. Those memories surfaced quickly as I parked in the driveway, but I pushed them aside, grabbed the wine, and walked up the steps. From the moment the door opened, something felt off. My daughter-in-law greeted me politely, but her eyes skimmed over me as if she were checking an unnecessary item. Her mother was sitting in the living room, back straight, hands neatly folded on her knees, wearing a smile just sufficient to avoid being rude. I handed over the wine. My daughter-in-law took it and set it on the shelf without looking at the label. No one asked if I was tired or if I wanted to sit down. I chose a seat myself on the chair by the dining table where I had sat before, the one whose leg I remembered fixing when it used to wobble. Dinner began with conversations I didn't belong to. Vacation plans, someone they knew who had bought a house somewhere far away, school matters of the neighbors' kids. I listened and nodded at the right moments. I was used to this. A few times I thought about adding something, then decided not to, because no one seemed to be waiting. When it came time to rearrange seats, my daughter-in-law assigned places as if it were something that required careful planning. I stood up out of habit, then stopped, because no one called my name. That sentence came then, light, clear, and sharp enough to cut through everything. I don't remember what I said right after, if I said anything at all. I only remember standing up, setting the glass of water down on the table with almost comical care, as if afraid to spill it. My son didn't look at me. He stared at the table, at the neatly folded napkin in front of him. No one said anything else. The silence spread, thick and heavy. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was a familiar sense of displacement, like walking into a room and realizing the conversation ended before you arrived. I heard myself say that my heart wasn't well, that I should head home early. My voice was steady, calm enough that no one felt the need to worry. I said goodbye. No one asked me to stay. At the door, I suddenly realized I had taken off my jacket, the old gray one my wife used to like, and left it on the back of the chair. I turned back and looked for a second. No one called out. I opened the door and stepped outside. The night was cool. The wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass. I drove slowly, not out of fear, but because there was no reason to hurry. Streetlights passed one by one, evenly spaced. For a brief moment, I thought of years past, when I used to drive home late, exhausted but comforted by knowing someone was waiting. The thought passed quickly, like an old photograph turned to the next page. When I got home, I hung up my keys, washed my hands, and sat down in my usual chair. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet I had lived with for years. I brewed a cup of tea, set it on the table, then picked up my phone without a clear purpose. Maybe I just wanted to look at something glowing in the dark. The screen showed a notification from the bank, a brief line about an automatic transaction. I stared at it longer than usual. A number, an account name, something I had grown used to not questioning. That night, for the first time in a long while, I didn't dismiss the notification right away. At that moment, I began to doubt everything I had believed was right. Do you want to know what I discovered in those statements? If so, comment, continue. The bank notification appeared like an accidental line intruding into my familiar life. Automatic transfer, a significant amount of money. The recipient's name was my son's, followed by an account number I had seen so many times I no longer read it carefully. I tapped it. The screen opened the transaction history. My finger scrolled down, slower than usual, as if afraid of touching something sharp. Every line looked the same. The 15th of the month. Transfer. A brief note, like a clock ticking steadily for 5 years, 6 years, maybe longer. I sat up straight. The tea on the table grew cold, but I didn't reach for it anymore. I turned on the desk lamp, the yellow light spilling over the wooden surface worn by time. The room was quiet, broken only by the low hum of the heater down the hall. I opened the banking app on my computer so I could see more clearly. The larger screen made the numbers stand out, like stepping back and realizing the painting isn't what you thought. I filtered by recipient, then by time period. The list grew longer, scrolling endlessly. Once a month, unfailingly. I remembered my son's calls, his hurried voice, saying he just needed temporary help for a few months, that everything would be fine. I also remembered my daughter-in-law standing beside him, thanking me politely, her smile as thin as a pre-printed greeting card. At the time, I didn't see it as a burden. I saw it as a father's duty. I took an old calculator from the drawer, the one I used to calculate construction materials. I entered each amount, not fast, not slow. Add, add, add. The number climbed, then climbed again. I had to stop a few times after pressing the wrong key. Strangely, I wasn't angry. What surfaced first was a hollow feeling, like realizing you paid for a movie ticket but never actually got to enter the theater. I stood up and went to the cabinet where I kept old files. There are things you store away because you think you'll never need them again. Inside were my wife's insurance papers, copies of old contracts, and a thick envelope labeled in blue ink. My son's house. I stared at the handwriting for a moment. It was mine, from when my hand was steadier, before the slight tremor at the start of each stroke. I pulled out a chair and sat back down, took the papers out. Inside were early transfer receipts, a printed bank confirmation email. Automatic transfer setup. My eyes stopped on the date. It was spring. I remembered because the lawn in front of the house had just turned green again, and my wife was still alive then. She had been standing in the kitchen, drying a plate, asking if I was sure. I said I was. I said our son needed a start. She didn't argue, just nodded and went to the bedroom to get her notebook. That notebook was still in the drawer beside the sofa. I walked over and opened it. There it was, the brown leather cover worn at the corners, the strap slightly stretched. I brought it to the table and placed it beside the computer. When I opened it, the smell of old paper mixed with her faint perfume. The first page listed small things. Buy more light bulbs, dentist appointment, call her sister in Ohio. On later pages, her slightly slanted handwriting began outlining retirement plans, ordinary dreams, a coastal road trip, a week near a lake, a backyard with a wooden chair to drink coffee. I flipped a few more pages. There was one line she wrote, "Save some for Michael if he needs it, but remember to save for yourself too." Just one sentence, and yet I had to rest my hand on the table for a moment to keep myself from slipping somewhere else. I didn't cry. I didn't do anything dramatic. I just sat there, listening to the wind against the window. Those plans never happened, not because I was poor, but because I always believed everything could wait. I went back to the computer. I opened the statements and downloaded them year by year. The printed pages stacked up, clean white paper that somehow felt heavy as stone. I highlighted each transfer with a marker, line by line. My hands worked with the habits of someone who once managed job sites. Don't miss details. Don't rely on memory. When I finished, I looked at the pages like a wall. Every line was another time I had helped temporarily, with no end in sight. I turned back to the file and pulled out more documents. These I didn't remember filing. A refinancing notice, a copy of a mortgage, a notarized receipt. I read slowly, following each line. So many legal terms, so many numbers, but some words were unmistakably clear. My name was there. My signature was there. And under collateral, it wasn't my son's house, it was mine. I straightened my back. The air in the room seemed to thicken. I put on my glasses and looked again. The collateral address was my house. The signing date matched the time my son said he needed money to get through a rough patch. I remembered clearly that day he came with a stack of papers. He said I just needed to sign so the bank could process things faster. He said I wouldn't have to pay anything because he would. I signed out of trust. I signed on instinct. I picked up my phone, about to call my son immediately. My finger touched his name, then stopped. I didn't want to call in this state. I also didn't want to hear a carefully prepared apology. I set the phone down, walked into the kitchen, took a bottle of water from the fridge, and drank. The cold water grounded me. I went back to the table and opened another email folder. I rarely checked email anymore because most messages were ads. I searched for loan, then refinance, then the bank's name. A list appeared. Some emails had never been opened. I clicked one with a dry subject line. Annual escrow analysis. I didn't understand everything, but near the end there was a line about payment and loan information. I looked at the account number, then at the printed pages. They matched. My heart beat more distinctly, not fast, but heavy. I wasn't someone who panicked easily. I had sat through tense meetings with difficult clients, handled worksite accidents, dealt with decades of tax paperwork. But this felt different. It wasn't a problem to solve. It was like a door opening behind me, revealing a long hallway I never knew existed. I returned to the banking app and clicked on the loan section. I hoped to see closed or paid off, or anything reassuring. Instead, a list appeared, and there, besides the mortgage on my house that I was still paying regularly, was another loan. The balance was substantial. Borrower, Michael. Collateral, my house. I stared at the name Michael as if seeing it in a mirror and not recognizing myself. I scrolled further. The associated property wasn't my son's house, it was mine. I tapped the details. A PDF opened. The first page showed the bank logo, filled-in fields, and a line at the bottom corner. Lien recorded, like a red stamp pressed into my life. I rested my hand on the table, steadying it. In my head, the sentence from my son's house echoed like a spoon tapping a glass. You don't have the right to sit here. I looked back at the screen, then at my wife's notebook, still open to that page. I didn't need to be smarter than anyone. I just needed confirmation. I dialed the bank's customer service number, then hung up before it connected. Too late for a long call. It was already night. I needed sleep, but I couldn't. I needed calm, but there was a crack running through me. I shut down the computer, stacked the papers neatly, and placed them back in the envelope. I closed my wife's notebook, tied the strap, and set it on the shelf as if placing something sacred. I went to the bedroom but didn't get into bed right away. I stood at the window, looking out at the street. A car passed, headlights briefly sweeping across the living room wall. Then darkness returned. At that moment, my phone buzzed. A message from my son. Just one line. Dad, don't overthink tonight. Everything will be fine. I read it, then looked at the stack of papers on the table. Some sentences sound gentle, but when placed next to numbers and signatures, they become something else. I set the phone down without replying. That night, I no longer felt like I had simply been pushed out of a dinner. I began to see something larger, deeper, lying beneath the surface of family, and my name was written all over it. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Late December in Oregon was pale gray, with a fine drizzle like mist. I brewed black coffee, took one sip, then set it down. I had barely slept, not from panic, but because my mind kept circling the same spot, like a needle stuck in a groove. I opened the envelope again, checking everything once more. My name, my address, a loan I didn't truly remember agreeing to. I called the bank as soon as business hours began. The representative's voice was even, polite. She verified my information, asked for my date of birth, address, the last 4 digits of my social security number. I answered, feeling as though I were reciting details about someone else. When she repeated the loan amount and account status, I didn't interrupt. I asked directly if my house was indeed the collateral. She hesitated for exactly 1 beat, then confirmed. I asked where the loan funds were disbursed. She said the disbursement had gone into an account in my son Daniel's name, and that everything was valid because the signatures were in place. I listened, my throat drying. She said if I wanted the original documents, I could visit a branch or request copies by email. I chose the branch. I wanted the papers in my hands. I changed clothes, put on my jacket, locked the door. On the drive, rain struck the windshield in a steady rhythm, the wipers moving back and forth without emotion. I passed a small park where my wife used to walk the dog. I didn't stop. Today wasn't for memories. The bank branch sat beside a grocery store and a pharmacy. The parking lot was wet, the smell of asphalt rising as cars passed. Inside, it was warm, with a mix of air conditioning and cheap perfume. A few older people waited, each holding envelopes or passbooks. A wall poster advertised favorable loan packages, showing a smiling family. I glanced at it, then looked away. A staff member led me into a small room and brought out copies of the file in a clear plastic folder. I looked at the signature. It was mine. There was no denying it. The date, the location, the processing officer's name. everything neat and proper, as if a life could be bound neatly in a file. I asked how this loan existed without me clearly remembering its terms. She responded with careful phrases. Maybe I was busy. Maybe I trusted a family member. The system recognized the documents because of the signature. I didn't argue. I asked one more question. If my son stopped paying, what would happen? She looked at me differently then and explained late notices, fees, the collection process. She didn't need to finish. I understood where it could lead. Outside, the rain continued, wind slipping through my collar. I stood under the awning for a moment, then called my son. He answered faster than I expected. His voice sounded normal, slightly groggy, as if trying to maintain routine. "Dad? Are you free? I need to talk." A brief silence, then he said yes, though he mentioned he was busy today. I didn't ask with what. I said I was coming over. He gave me the address as if I didn't already know the way. I ended the call, sat in the car, my hands on the steering wheel, the cold firmness under my palms. My son's house appeared after a bend in the road, still beautiful like a postcard. The lawn was green even in the cold season, a clear sign of an automatic sprinkler system. The porch light was on even though it was still daytime, the warm yellow glow looking from afar like a welcome. I parked and walked up. This time, I didn't bring wine. I brought an envelope of documents. My daughter-in-law opened the door. Her smile appeared at exactly the right moment, then disappeared just as precisely. She glanced at the envelope in my hand, her eyes sweeping over it as if assessing an inconvenience. "Daniel is in the kitchen," she said, stepping aside, not quite inviting me in, not quite blocking the way either. I stepped inside. The scent of scented candles was stronger than the night before, a blend of vanilla and cedarwood. In the corner of the living room stood a Christmas tree nearly touching the ceiling, decorated so brightly it looked like a store display. I noticed a few gift boxes under the tree, wrapped in new paper with neatly tied ribbons. I walked past without touching them. My son stood in the kitchen, holding a coffee mug, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked like a middle-aged man doing just fine, nothing about him suggesting someone dragging a massive debt behind him. When he saw me, he set the mug down and forced a smile. "Dad, you left early last night." I didn't circle around the issue. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter. The stone surface was glossy, without a scratch. I told him I had gone to the bank. I clearly stated what I had seen. My name, my house, a loan in his name. And I asked directly, "Explain it to me." My son looked at the envelope as if it were hot. He reached out, then pulled his hand back. My daughter-in-law leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, her face expressionless. "Dad, about that?" Daniel started, then stopped. He glanced at his wife as if looking for a signal. She spoke up instead. Her voice was smooth, slightly high, the familiar tone used in customer service calls. She said maybe I had misunderstood. She said I had volunteered to help at the time. She said this was family, and everything would work out once Michael got promoted or when the market improved. I asked why, then her mother had said the night before that I had no right to sit there. She curled her lip ever so slightly, as if that sentence were just an awkward social moment. She said her mother was hot-tempered and told me not to take it personally. Right then, her mother walked in from the hallway, still dressed neatly as if heading to a party. She looked me up and down, then at the envelope on the counter. She didn't ask how I was doing. She said plainly, in a quiet but clear voice, that money matters shouldn't be discussed at home, that what I was doing was tactless. Then she added almost casually that older men often worry too much, imagine things, and turn everything heavy. I stood still. I felt irritation rise in my chest, but I held it back. I asked my son again whether this was a loan secured by my house. He looked down at the floor and nodded very slightly. I asked if he had clearly told me that when I signed. He didn't answer. My daughter-in-law sighed and said everything had been rushed back then, that I signed anyway, so there was no point digging it up now. Her mother let out a small laugh. Not loud, but enough to chill the kitchen. She said I signed it, so I bore the responsibility. No one forced me. She said men like me like to play the martyr and then complain later. She said her daughter had been through enough and didn't need more drama right before the holidays. I looked out the kitchen window. The backyard was gray, the rain thin like mist. I heard the wall clock ticking. I remembered all the times I swallowed things to keep the peace. The times I stepped out of their conversations so I wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. The times I sat quietly in a corner, smiled at the right moments, then left early so they wouldn't have to worry about me. That habit of retreat had turned into a soft carpet they could step on without thinking. My daughter-in-law walked over, placed a hand on her husband's arm as reassurance, then turned to me. She said if I wanted to talk, we could do it in the garage for convenience, since the kitchen still needed to be prepared. The suggestion was delivered gently, like a reasonable offer, but it carried the scent of pushing me out again, to the back, where no one had to see. I followed them into the garage. The door was half open, cold air rushing in, the smell of gasoline and rubber mixing with fresh wall paint. In the corner hung an expensive bicycle on a rack. On a shelf were brand new boxes of Christmas decorations. I stood in that space like a guest temporarily allowed to remain. My son stood across from me. He said not to make a big deal out of it. He said he would handle it. He said if I kept pushing, his wife would be hurt and the family would fracture. I heard him say family, and in my head replayed the words from the night before. You don't have the right to sit here. There are families that don't need shouting to push someone out. Just a few polite sentences, a door opening to the garage, and a lifetime habit of stepping aside. I took a breath, not deep, just enough to keep my voice from breaking. I said I wasn't there to argue. I was there to know the truth and to know what he planned to do about my house being in his name. My son looked at me, his eyes reddening slightly. Not the eyes of someone remorseful, but of someone caught in the middle and choosing the easiest path. He reached into a jacket pocket hanging nearby and pulled out a stack of papers. He spoke quickly, saying I just needed to sign one more thing to rearrange everything. He said if I signed, the bank would extend the terms and it would all pass. He held the papers out to me, his hand trembling slightly. Behind him, my daughter-in-law leaned against the wall, her face cold as stone. Her mother stood at the garage entrance, watching me like someone waiting for an ending she was certain would go her way. I looked at the papers. On top was a page with a clearly marked signature line, bold print in the corner. My son held out a pen to me, as if offering something familiar. I didn't take it right away. I looked at his face, then at the blank space meant for my signature. And at that moment, I saw that my son had already signed elsewhere on the page, his handwriting still fresh, as if he had signed it just before handing it to me. He avoided my eyes and said quickly it was just a formality. I stayed silent for a second, not long, but long enough for the rain on the metal roof to sound louder. I didn't sign. I also didn't throw the papers aside like in a movie. I simply set the pen down on the nearby tool shelf, slowly, as if placing something fragile. I told my son I would take the papers home to read, then decide. My daughter-in-law let out a short laugh, the kind that couldn't quite hide her contempt. Her mother didn't laugh. She just lifted her chin, her eyes measuring me. "Dad, doing this means you don't trust me," my son said, his voice faltering. "I trusted you long enough," I replied, not loudly, but clearly enough in the cold, gasoline-scented garage. Some people say parents should support their children no matter the cost. Others believe that helping to the point of losing control of your own life is wrong. Who do you think is right? I took my envelope and went back inside to get my jacket. No one handed it to me. No one said, "Dad, you forgot this." I walked into the living room myself. The Christmas tree glowed brightly, its lights blinking steadily. I looked at the chair where my jacket had been left the night before. Empty. I put my jacket on, zipped it up, and headed for the door. My son followed me to the porch, stopping at the threshold as if held back by an invisible cord. He said quietly, "Dad, don't turn this into a war." I didn't answer. I stepped down the stairs, fine rain speckling my shoulders. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. The sound of tires on wet pavement was steady, almost soothing, but my mind was alert. I thought about what the bank employee had said that morning, about my signature sitting neatly in a file like a stamp. I remembered the day my son brought the papers, sitting at my kitchen table, speaking quickly, eyes darting away. I signed with hands still smelling of dish soap, believing procedure was a harmless word. Trust doesn't always collapse at once. It cracks slowly until one touch leaves your hands covered in dust. When I got home, I opened the cabinet and took out a small wooden box where I keep important things. Inside were my son's birth certificate, my marriage certificate, a few old photographs, and a pen. A black pen with a metal body, scratched near the clip, something I bought for myself when I was young after signing my first contract for my small construction company. That day, my hands shook from fear and excitement. I remembered my wife standing beside me, smiling, saying my signature looked more respectable with a proper pen. I placed the pen on the table, opened my laptop, and began searching for real estate and mortgage lawyers in the area. I didn't look for famous names. I looked for small offices with clear addresses and genuine reviews. I made 3 calls. 2 appointments were after the holidays. One appointment opened that same afternoon because of a cancellation. I wrote the address down, placed the envelope and the pen into my bag out of habit from years of preparing to meet clients. The law office was in a low building near a main road with a narrow parking lot. Inside, it smelled of coffee and printer paper. A receptionist handed me a form and asked my reason for visiting. I wrote briefly, "Loan and property ownership issue." When I finished, I looked at my handwriting, straight but stiff, like someone trying to stay calm by writing neatly. The lawyer was a man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, glasses, a firm handshake. He invited me into his office and said plainly that he would ask uncomfortable questions and that I should answer as if speaking to a doctor. I nodded. I laid out the documents on the table. He read slowly, turning each page, sometimes pausing to mark a line with his pen. I talked about the monthly transfers, about the loan in my name tied to property I didn't control the way I thought. I described the garage conversation, the stack of papers my son handed me, the fact that he had already signed. I didn't embellish. I just told exactly what happened. The lawyer opened his computer, logged into the county's public record system, and typed in my address. The screen displayed a longer list than I expected. He turned the monitor toward me and pointed to each entry. One lien, then another, then an entry for refinancing, restructuring. Some dated back to years when I still thought I was just helping temporarily. "Your house has been used as collateral more than once," the lawyer said. I stared at the list, feeling as if the ground beneath me had been pulled away. I asked if he was sure. He nodded, saying these were public records. He briefly explained how a property can be repeatedly leveraged, how paperwork can be structured so the signer bears responsibility while control rests elsewhere, depending on how it's arranged. I asked a simple question, one that sounded almost childish. "So what rights do I have?" The lawyer looked at me, paused for a beat, then said something that made me grip the edge of the chair. "You carry the responsibility, but you don't have equivalent rights." There was no moral judgment in that sentence. It was a dry legal conclusion, but it hit me like icy water to the face. I swallowed and asked what would happen if my son stopped paying. The lawyer didn't threaten or comfort me. He explained the process. He talked about late notices, penalties, the possibility of legal action, the bank's right to seize the property. He asked if I had received any notices yet. I said no. He said that didn't mean there was no problem. It could be that minimum payments were being made or temporary extensions were in place. He asked me to provide records of the monthly transfers and any documents related to family agreements, including messages and emails. I opened my phone and showed him the message my son sent the night before. He read it and set the phone down without comment. The lawyer said he needed to know the total debt tied to my house, not just what I had already seen. He called someone in the office to retrieve a consolidated report. I waited, looking out the window. Outside, an elderly couple walked into the pharmacy next door, holding hands. The man held an umbrella. The woman carried a paper bag. They moved slowly, but together. The sight tightened my throat, not from envy, but because it reminded me that life can be simple if you don't turn it into an endless installment plan. The report was brought in. The lawyer placed it on the table and pointed to the total figure. It was larger than the number I had calculated at home, large enough to throw my heartbeat off by a fraction. I asked again, thinking I had misread it. He pointed out the components: principal, interest, fees, accumulated charges. He explained that some amounts didn't appear in my regular transfers because they might have been paid from other sources or rolled into the debt. That was the second blow. The first was being pushed away from the dinner table. The second was seeing myself carrying a debt no one ever named in front of me. I sat still, forcing my breathing to remain steady. Images flashed through my mind. My son as a child holding my hand in the park. My wife writing retirement plans in her notebook. The late nights I worked believing I was building something solid. I didn't want to destroy my family. I also didn't want to die in a house someone else had signed away. The lawyer leaned closer, lowering his voice. He said he wasn't there to tell me whether to love or hate my son. He spoke only about rights and risks. He suggested steps, temporarily freezing any further signatures, formally requesting full documentation of all loans and liens, and, if necessary, sending an official demand for clarification. He said there were ways to protect my property, but they had to be done legally and at the right time. I nodded, though a cord inside me pulled the other way. My son is my son. I once carried him on my shoulders to watch fireworks. I promised my wife I would never let him break. And now I was sitting here, listening to a stranger explain that my name had become a tool. The lawyer looked at me and asked a question casually, like asking about the weather. But it sent a chill through me. Are you certain your son initiated this himself? Or is there someone behind him pushing him to sign, and pushing you to sign? I opened my mouth to answer immediately, but no words came out. In my mind appeared the garage, my daughter-in-law leaning against the wall, her mother standing at the door like a gatekeeper, and my son holding the pen out to me as if offering a habit. The lawyer didn't rush me. He slid a piece of paper toward me and said that if I wanted to move forward, I needed to be honest with myself about who was actually controlling the board. I took the old pen from my pocket and placed it on the table, looking at it for a moment. That pen had signed contracts to build homes for others. Now it lay there before a fight I had never wanted to enter. I stood up, thanked the lawyer, and said I would send more documents. Outside, darkness had already fallen early. Streetlights came on, their reflections stretching across the wet road. I sat in my car without starting the engine, the list of liens running through my mind, my son's message still glowing on my phone. I no longer thought the question was whether I should save the family or not. The question was changing shape. And I knew that when I got home and opened the files again, another detail would be waiting, because people who orchestrate things like this don't stop at a single signature. I returned home, turned on the living room light, and left the television off. The silence in the house was familiar, but that night it felt different, as if the house itself were waiting for me to decide whether I was still the owner or merely a temporary caretaker. I set my bag on the table, took out the documents, and organized them. The old pen lay beside them, its metal surface reflecting the warm light. I thought about calling my son, telling him I had met a lawyer, asking directly who was behind this, but I didn't. I chose silence one more time, not because I was weak, but because I needed to see what would happen if I didn't rush in to clean things up like always. I wanted to know the truth in how they behaved without me backing them. The next morning, a message came early. It was from my daughter-in-law, not my son. "Dad, my mom has a get-together at the club today. Please don't come by our house. It's messy and you're under stress. Rest and take care of yourself." The words sounded caring, but I read something else. Don't come, don't appear, don't disrupt the atmosphere. I didn't reply. I made coffee, ate a slice of toast, then went out back to clear the clogged gutters. With all the rain, wet leaves had built up. I stood on a ladder, gloved hands pulling out soggy clumps. The simple task eased my mind. When I climbed down, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my son. "Dad, are you okay? She said you're stressed. Don't make things harder. We're trying to manage." I read the message and set the phone down on the kitchen table. I didn't want to argue by text. I didn't want to hear words like manage and trying anymore. Those words felt like a kitchen rag, used to cover a mess until guests arrive. The next 2 days passed in a strange quiet. No one asked what I had done. No one apologized about the garage. No one mentioned the papers. I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, it was my daughter-in-law's mother. She didn't greet me. She asked whether I still had a key to my son's house. I said I didn't. She paused, then said, "Good. Things like that shouldn't be held by outsiders." I heard the word outsider like a hammer striking a doorframe. I asked what she meant. She laughed lightly and said I was sensitive, that she just wanted everything in its proper place. She added calmly, "You should understand that for important events, people need the right image." Then she hung up. That evening, I received an email invitation. It wasn't addressed to me personally. It was a group invitation my daughter-in-law had sent to family and friends, a pre-designed card with a red background and gold lettering. Holiday open house at their house, Saturday night, 7 p.m. I looked at the recipient list and saw my name included. I thought perhaps they were still inviting me, but immediately after a private message from my daughter-in-law appeared. "Dad, I sent that email to the wrong list. This Saturday there are a few important guests of my mom's from the school board. Please don't come. If people ask about work, about education, I'm afraid it would make you uncomfortable. Can we see each other after the holidays?" I finished reading and didn't feel angry right away. What rose first was a heat at the back of my neck, then a coldness in my fingertips. They didn't say, "You're not welcome," like the night before. They said, "Don't come so it won't be awkward." They turned, excluding me, into a form of politeness. I walked into the living room and looked at the armchair by the window where I usually sat to read the newspaper. I pulled the chair closer to the table and placed my wife's notebook on it, like a reminder that I wasn't allowed to forget who I was. Then I sat down, opened my phone, and called my son. I wanted to hear his voice, not read his wife's words. He picked up after a few rings. His voice was low, like he was standing somewhere in the house where he didn't want anyone to hear. "Dad, why are you calling? You sent an invitation and then told me not to come. What's that about?" I asked. I kept my voice even, but the question wasn't soft. He exhaled, the kind of breath of someone who had practiced an answer. "Dad, it's just one event. My mother-in-law, they're sensitive. You know that. If you come, they'll start talking again. I don't want more tension." "I'm your father," I said, "not some stranger off the street." Silence. I heard something on the other end, maybe the TV, maybe someone walking past. Then my son said, "Dad, don't make me choose." That sentence made me stand up. Not because I wanted to yell, but because I realized I'd been placed in a strange position. A father being asked to understand that his presence was an inconvenience. I looked out the window. The sky was dark early, the neighbors' lights coming on, the glow breaking through the rain into blurred circles. "I'm not making you choose," I said. "I'm asking what you're doing with your life, and with the house that's in my name." My son stammered, said the loan would be taken care of. He said he'd signed restructuring papers, that I just needed to sign one more thing so the bank would extend it. He said if I kept pushing, everything would collapse. He said the last sentence very fast, like he was trying to dodge, "If you love me, Dad, help me one more time." On the other end, another voice cut in. Unclear words, but clearly a woman's voice. My daughter-in-law. She said something, then my son spoke again, his tone turning harder. "Dad, stop. Go rest. I'll call you later." I hadn't even said anything before the call ended. I held the phone and watched the screen go dark. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a clean cut. I sat back down, my hand resting on the arm of the chair. In my mind, I saw a party. Laughter, wine glasses, Christmas lights, and in one corner, an empty chair. No one asked who that chair was for because they were used to me disappearing on my own. That empty chair wasn't just a seat. It was their way of saying I could be left out without the party losing any joy. I stood up and went to the cabinet to get the envelope of documents. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the dining table where I usually sat alone. I took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote a few short lines to keep my thoughts from scattering. Date and time to meet the lawyer. List of documents to copy. Points to ask about my rights. I didn't write feelings. I wrote tasks. My phone buzzed again. A message from my daughter-in-law's mother. "Don't make things worse. You're not young enough to play the victim." There was no layer of politeness. She chose to be direct. I looked at the message, my fingers tightening. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but because I could clearly see they were escalating. Every time I gave in, they moved one step further. Every time I stayed silent, they took it as consent. I went into my small office where I kept the printer. I printed out the list of liens the lawyer had shown me, printed the bank statements of the transfers, printed the messages. I clipped them into a stiff folder. I did everything like someone preparing a court file, even though I didn't know how far I would go. I only knew one thing. I couldn't let them keep using my silence as the background for their normal life. That night I sat again with the old pen. I rolled it between my fingers, listening to the soft tap of metal. My wife used to say a signature had value because it was tied to honor. I had signed many things out of love, but love couldn't be a noose. I opened my phone and didn't call my son. I sent a short message, just one sentence. From now on, any paperwork related to the house and the loan, send it by email for me to review. I'm not signing anything else until my lawyer looks at it. I hit send, set the phone down, and turned off the living room lights. In the darkness, I listened to the rain tapping on the roof. I knew after that message they wouldn't be calm, and I also knew a quiet decision had already been made. I would stop playing the role of the empty chair. Monday morning, I woke up while it was still dark. Not energized, not from insomnia, just my body used to needing to do something important before the day swallowed me back into old habits. I washed my face, shaved, put on a thick jacket, then sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and my phone. I didn't call my son. I didn't text again. I opened my contacts, dialed the bank, and listened to the familiar hold music. When the representative answered, I said I wanted to stop a recurring transfer. My voice was so normal that even I found it strange, like I was asking to change a cable package. She asked to verify my identity. I answered clearly. She found the transaction and read back the details. The amount, the date, the receiving account. Hearing her read it, I felt each number like bricks I had personally carried to build a wall between myself and my own life. She asked when I wanted the stop to take effect. I looked at the calendar on the wall, saw the date clearly, and said immediately, "Effective now." There was a small pause on the other end of the line, like she was waiting for me to change my mind. But she just said, "Okay," and typed. The soft clicking of the keyboard sounded small, but in my head it echoed like a hammer. When she confirmed "It's canceled," I didn't overdo a thank you. I just asked one more question. "From now on, it won't run automatically, right?" She said, "Correct, unless a new request was signed by the account holder." I hung up and sat still for a few seconds. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I placed my hand on my chest lightly, like checking whether my heart was still beating evenly. A thin thread of worry passed through me, like a draft through a crack. But behind that worry was something else, unfamiliar. Not triumph, but lightness. Light, like setting down a heavy bag you'd carried too long without realizing how deep the marks on your shoulders were. I didn't stop there. I made another call to the branch and scheduled an in-person meeting to get everything confirmed in writing. I wanted paper. I wanted clarity. I didn't want anything left in the gray zone of family. By noon, I was sitting in the bank waiting area again. Green fabric chairs, cool white lighting. The staff handed me a confirmation of the canceled recurring transfer with the date, time, and internal code. I held the paper and noticed my hand wasn't shaking. I folded it and slipped it into my folder, like putting a stone in my pocket to remind myself this was real. Leaving the bank, the sky was still gray. I drove along the river road and stopped to buy a hot sandwich at a small shop. The clerk asked if I wanted coffee. I nodded and carried the warm paper cup in my hand. Life kept moving on small tasks like that, and sometimes it was those small tasks that kept you from collapsing under the big ones. That evening, I left my phone on, not silent, not vibrate. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to know how they would react when the money tap suddenly closed. Around 8, the screen lit up. Not my son, my daughter-in-law. She called 3 times in a row, then sent a message. "What did you do? Call back now." I didn't call back. I washed the dishes, wiped the table, locked the door like usual. 10 minutes later, my son called. I answered. "Dad." His voice was completely different. No more hedging, no more circling. It was panicked. "Dad, did you stop the transfer?" "Yes," I said. There was heavy breathing on the other end. Then he spoke fast, afraid of losing time. "You can't do that. We have a payment due. There are fees. There's—" He stopped, then suddenly lowered his voice like switching tactics. "Dad, we're stuck. Just help us get through this month." I looked at the folder on the table, at the confirmation paper inside. I said I'd been clear. All documents had to be sent for my lawyer to review. I added that if they wanted to talk, we'd talk directly, not in the garage, not by pushing me out back. My son went quiet. Then my daughter-in-law's voice cut in, clearer, like she'd taken the phone from his hand. "So you're punishing your own son?" she said sharply. "You think that makes you noble? You want to destroy my family?" "I'm stopping payments for something I'm not allowed to sit at," I said, my voice still even. She scoffed. "Did you hear that, Daniel? He's turning himself into a victim. This trick is old." I heard my son say something softly. Then my daughter-in-law continued, fast and pressing. "If you stop, you bear the consequences. Your name is on it. You're responsible. You think we're afraid of you?" I didn't argue over the phone. I said one last sentence. "Send all the documents by email. If not, I'll follow legal advice to protect my house." Then I hung up. I sat there and breathed out. The fear from earlier returned, sharper. Not fear of what they might do, but fear of the chaos coming, fear of the noise shaking my resolve, fear that old habits would soften me again. I stood up, poured a glass of water, took a sip, and set it down. In the kitchen mirror, I saw an old man with gray hair trying to keep his back straight. I reminded myself I didn't need to play any role. I just needed to stand in the right place. When one person stops carrying the weight, the whole system around them starts to shake. Not because they're cruel, but because the system has grown used to them carrying the heaviest part without a word. The next morning, the messages started. My daughter-in-law's mother said I was selfish. My daughter-in-law said I was sabotaging and smearing the family. My son's messages were longer, shifting between pleading and blaming. One said, "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Another said, "Do you want me to lose my house?" Each message was like a rope thrown out, trying to pull me back to my old place. I didn't reply right away. I took screenshots, saved them, and sent them to the lawyer as requested. I made a simple lunch, then drove to an office supply store to buy more folders. I figured I'd have a lot of paper to keep. That afternoon, my phone rang repeatedly from an unknown number. I answered one call. A man's voice, unfriendly, introduced himself by name and said he was a family friend, and that I should behave properly because it was a small town and everyone knew everyone. I asked who he was. He didn't answer clearly, only said it would get messy if I made things public. I ended the call and blocked the number. That night I received an email from my daughter-in-law. Not documents, a long piece of writing like an indictment. She said I'd promised to help and was now turning my back. She said I was using money to control them. She mentioned my wife, saying that if she were still alive, she'd be ashamed of me. That line made my hand tighten. But I didn't respond. I forwarded the email to the lawyer and closed the laptop. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought they'd keep it within the family. I was wrong. 3 days later, while I was at the auto shop getting an oil change, a man standing by the coffee machine recognized me. He looked at me, hesitated, then asked, "You're Michael, right? You worked in construction before?" I nodded. He said he'd read a post in the local community group about an elderly father using finances to pressure his son during the holidays. He asked in a half-curious, half-uneasy tone, like people use when talking about an accident. I paid and walked to my car, my hands cold. I opened my phone and went to the community group he mentioned. The post was there, widely shared, heavy with comments. The title read like a moral lesson: when parents use money to punish their children. There was a photo of my son's house taken from the street, Christmas lights glowing beautifully. There was a story saying I had abandoned them, that I'd suddenly cut off support, putting them at risk of losing their home. The author didn't use a real name, but I recognized the voice, the polished wording, the way it turned itself into a polite victim, my daughter-in-law. I scrolled through the comments. A few people defended me, but not many. Most asked, "What's wrong with that father?" Some said, "Old and still controlling." Others said, "A familiar kind of controlling parent." I read line after line, feeling like I'd been dragged into a public square without the right to speak first. I turned off the screen and set the phone on the passenger seat. Rain started falling again, tapping on the roof. I sat in the car, looking at the parking lot outside the auto shop where people came and went as usual. I thought of the empty chair at their party, and now another chair, my seat in the community's eyes, being pulled away. I started the engine and drove home with one thought left in my head. They had chosen to make this public. And when they chose public, I no longer had an obligation to stay silent to protect an image I'd never been allowed to belong to. I got home and didn't go inside right away. I sat in the car for a moment, watching thin rain streak across the porch light. The phone lay still on the seat like a foreign object. I used to think dignity was something you preserved by enduring quietly. But that post showed me something else. If you stay silent too long, someone else will tell your story in the way that benefits them most. I went inside, hung up my coat, washed my hands, and opened the laptop. I didn't rush to comment. I didn't hit reply like someone reacting in anger. I opened the post and took screenshots of every section, every notable comment, the photo of my son's house, the posting time. I downloaded everything I could. I named the files by date and time, saved them in a separate folder, then backed them up to an external drive. The motions were steady, like inventory work, but inside me a tight wire was pulled taut. That night I didn't sleep deeply. Not because I was afraid someone would come to my house, but because of the feeling of standing in the open while strangers pointed. I woke up close to 3 a.m. and went to the kitchen for water. In the dim kitchen light, I saw my reflection in the oven door. A man in his 60s, gray-haired, shoulders slightly rounded from a lifetime of labor. I didn't see an irresponsible man like they'd written. I saw someone who had carried too much for too long and had been pushed off his chair the moment he stopped. The next morning, I went out front to get the newspaper. My neighbor across the street, Tom, was dragging his trash bin to the curb. Tom was the kind of guy who always said hello, always made a comment about the weather or last night's game. That day, he didn't smile like usual. He waited until I came closer, then spoke softly, like he didn't want the wind to hear. "Michael, are you okay?" A simple question. But it dried my throat. I knew what he was asking. He was asking about the post, about whether the whole neighborhood had read it, about the label someone had just stuck on my back. "I'm okay," I said. I didn't try to sound strong. I just said the two words. Tom nodded, looked down at his shoes, then back at me. "I don't want to get involved in people's family business, but if you need someone to say you've always lived straight around here, just say the word." He said that and rolled his bin away like he'd just finished a delicate task. I stood there with the newspaper in my hand, listening to the plastic wheels rattle on the sidewalk. The feeling of being misunderstood was no longer online. It had stepped onto the street, stood next to the trash bin, stood under my porch. I went back inside, set the paper down, and sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. I wanted to argue back. I wanted to write a long post explaining everything they'd done, including the outsider comment and the garage. But I didn't do it right away. I remembered the lawyer's advice. Don't react emotionally when the other side is trying to pull you onto a field they chose. The more you argue with words, the easier it is to turn you into proof that you're unstable. So I chose a different way. I chose not to respond immediately. I called the lawyer and told him about the post. He told me to keep saving evidence and to avoid impulsive online confrontations. He asked if I could prove the money flow, prove the long-term support, and more importantly, prove they were creating a false narrative to pressure me. I said I had bank statements, I had messages, I had the bank's confirmation of stopping the transfer. He told me to print everything, organize it by timeline, and, if possible, find out who was helping them push the post. I hung my coat up, grabbed my car keys, and drove straight to the print shop. I brought the hard drive, the bank statements, the screenshots. I printed month by month, year by year, transaction after transaction, repeated over and over. There were pages I couldn't bear to look at for long. Not because the amounts were huge, but because every line of transfer came with an excuse attached in my head. Just temporary. Let him get through this phase. Buy this for the grandkid. Cover it first, he'll pay me back. I had lived on those excuses the way people live on sugar in their coffee. I came home with a thick paper bag. I spread everything out in the living room and sorted it. One stack was recurring transfers. One stack was repair bills and purchases I had paid for on their behalf. One stack was emails and messages, words that shifted from sweet to sour. I took cardboard folders, clipped them together, labeled them. The file grew thicker and thicker, like a book I never wanted to write, but needed if I wanted to tell the truth without begging anyone to believe me. In the afternoon, my son showed up at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there, dark coat, messy hair, a tired face. I opened the door but didn't invite him in right away. I stood in the doorway, letting the cold air slip between us like a necessary distance. "Dad," he said urgently, "have you seen the post?" "I've seen it," I replied. He swallowed. She posted it. She said it was so people would understand us. But now everything's gone too far. My mother-in-law is calling everyone. Please, Dad, go online and say something. Explain that you're just pausing. Say you'll help again. Just one sentence so they'll stop attacking us. I looked at him, trying to find even a trace of shame in his eyes for letting this happen. I saw only worry. Worry about the house. Worry about appearances. Worry about pressure. I asked him straight out, "Did you tell your wife to take the post down?" He shook his head as if that option didn't exist. "Dad, if we take it down now, it'll look even worse. Don't you get it? People will think we're guilty." Something sharp ran through me, not anger, disappointment, because my son had learned to live by other people's gaze to the point where fixing something wrong felt like a confession. "I'm not arguing online," I said, "and I'm not promising to pay again." He frowned. "You're punishing me." "I'm stopping," I said. "Those are two different things." He stood there, then his voice rose, irritation and exhaustion mixing together. "If you stop, we're finished. Do you want me to lose the house? Do you want your grandchild?" I raised my hand, not high, just enough to cut him off. "Don't use the kid to pull me back." He froze like he'd been slapped without being touched. I saw his eyes redden. A part of me wanted to hug him, to say, "Fine, I'll help," to step back into my old role in exchange for peace. That feeling flickered and went out, because right after it, I remembered the words in the garage, the empty chair, the way they had turned me into entertainment for the community. My son turned away without another word. He stepped down the porch steps, then stopped and threw one sentence back over his shoulder. "You don't understand how much influence my mother-in-law has." I closed the door, locked it, and leaned my back against it for a moment. Influence was a soft word, but I heard the threat underneath. That night I kept doing something I never thought I'd have to do at my age: research. I opened the post again and watched how it was being shared. I noticed several accounts commenting in a way that felt guided, repeating similar phrases, emphasizing that an elderly father was blackmailing with love. I clicked into their profiles. Many of them were connected to the same community organization, the same club, the same fundraising events my son's mother-in-law liked to show off. Then I saw a familiar name. Not familiar to me personally, but familiar from the local news. A female editor at the local outlet who often wrote about family life, community, and inspirational stories. I clicked her page. I saw she had just liked that post. I saw my son's mother-in-law had commented under her photos the week before, praising her articles, calling her by her first name. I sat up straighter. It was just a small link, a like, a comment. But in a city that wasn't very big, small things like that were connections. And if there were connections, the story might not have been just an impulsive post by my daughter-in-law. It might have been something they set up to apply pressure, to shame me into paying again. I printed another page, a screenshot of that connection. I clipped it into the file. The file was no longer just about money. It was about dignity. I didn't go to sleep right away. I went into the living room, pulled the armchair closer to the table, and turned on the warm light. I looked at the neatly clipped papers, at the old pen placed on top. I thought about timing. If I dumped everything online right away, I'd be dragged into a mud fight. If I waited too long, the false story would take root and become truth in people's mouths. I needed a moment they couldn't erase, couldn't twist, couldn't call made up. I needed a place where people had to look with their eyes, touch paper, see numbers, see signatures. I needed the right day, the right place, the right method. I opened my calendar and looked at the year-end dates coming up, at the gatherings my daughter-in-law loved to make flashy displays of. I remembered the invitation I'd been cut from. I remembered their house lit up like a stage with Christmas lights. I closed the calendar and rested my hand on the file folder. The decision about when to reveal the truth formed clearly in my mind, quiet but firm, like a stake driven into wet ground. And I knew that when I stepped forward with the truth, it would no longer be a family argument. It would be the moment the system they'd built with my money would collapse in front of the very people they most wanted to impress. I chose an evening they definitely wouldn't want a single scratch on their perfect picture. It was a neighborhood fundraising event held in a small hall near downtown, where people wore nice coats, brought homemade dishes, and took photos in front of a backdrop printed with sponsor names. My daughter-in-law loved places like that. Her mother loved them even more. There they were seen with admiration, addressed with polite titles, standing exactly where they believed they belonged. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need an invitation to enter a community event. I wore a white shirt and an old blazer that had been neatly pressed. I didn't choose anything new. I didn't want this to look like showing off. I just wanted it to be right. Before leaving, I placed the file into my leather briefcase. It felt heavier than I expected, not because of the paper, but because of the years inside it. I picked up the old pen and rolled it gently between my fingers. This pen had been with me when I signed my first contracts, back when I believed a signature was a man's promise. I slipped it into the small pocket of the briefcase, zipped it shut, and drove off just as dusk fell. The parking lot outside the hall was crowded. I spotted my son's car right in the front row, gleaming as if it had just been washed. I looked for a second, then turned away, not letting my eyes get caught on a familiar feeling. I walked inside. The air was warm, scented with food and light perfume. Laughter and chatter were thick, like layered fabric. Yellow lights made everything look gentler than it really was. I moved slowly, not hiding, not drawing attention. I saw my daughter-in-law near the registration table, smiling with a group of women. Her mother stood beside her, holding a drink, with the posture of someone who always felt entitled to judge. My son stood behind them, half participating, half standing apart, his eyes flicking around as if checking who was watching him. I didn't go straight to them. I went to the organizer's table, where a middle-aged woman was handing out name tags. I said my name. She hesitated for a moment, then remembered. She had probably read the post, too. A flicker of awkwardness crossed her eyes, but she still handed me a guest tag. I pinned it on, thanked her, and moved on. Inside the hall, there was a long table with flyers and program materials. I chose a spot nearby where the light was bright enough to read. I opened my briefcase and took out 12 prepared envelopes. I had put them together over 2 nights. Each envelope was the same. A summary of money transfers by year, bank statements of recurring payments, the bank confirmation of cancellation, selected messages, and screenshots of the post, along with the connection between my son's mother-in-law and the local media editor. I didn't put everything out. I only shared enough for people to see the structure. The rest I kept for my lawyer. I didn't make an announcement or try to command the room. I simply placed the envelopes on the materials table, right next to the glossy flyers, then sat down on a nearby chair like any ordinary attendee, hands resting on my knees. My heart was pounding, but my face was calm. I didn't want anyone to see me as someone seeking revenge. I wanted them to see me as someone placing the truth where it belonged. It spread faster than I expected. A gray-haired man walked up to the table, picked up an envelope, read the label, and opened it. He read the first few lines, his eyes stopping. He flipped a page, then another. He didn't say anything. He called his wife over, pointed at a number, and handed her the paper. She read, pressed her lips together. They exchanged a look I recognized well. The look people share when they realize they believed the wrong story. Others followed. Some picked one up out of curiosity. Some because they'd heard rumors. Some because they saw that first group fall silent. Within minutes, the materials table became a quiet circle. The laughter disappeared there. There was only the rustle of paper, soft breathing, someone whispering, "Oh my God," and swallowing it back. I watched and felt no satisfaction. I felt a strange sadness because, in the end, to be taken seriously, I had to carry paper like proof that I was real. My daughter-in-law noticed first. I saw her turn, scan the room, and stop dead at the table. The smile vanished from her face instantly. She walked fast, pushed through people, and yanked an envelope out of someone's hands. "What is this?" she hissed, trying to keep her voice just low enough to avoid a scene. "Who gave you permission to do this here?" I stood up. I didn't move close. I kept enough distance to avoid turning it into a face-off. "I'm just letting people read," I said. She turned to the crowd, forcing a crooked smile. "Don't believe this. He's not well. He's dragging out old paperwork to pressure my family." A woman from the fundraising group looked at her, calm but cold. "The documents have bank confirmation, statements with dates and account numbers. How exactly is that made up?" My son's mother-in-law stepped forward, pale-faced but chin still lifted. "This is a family matter. It shouldn't be brought into public," she said, as if she were the keeper of decorum. I nodded and said something I hadn't expected to come out so lightly. "I agree. I thought so too. But someone already brought it into public." My son appeared behind them. He saw the envelopes, saw people holding my papers, saw the looks in their eyes shift. He froze, mouth slightly open but no words coming. In that second, I looked at him and saw something I'd never seen clearly before. The confusion of a man who thought he was living in a home, only to realize he was standing on a stage. My daughter-in-law began to lose control. She raised her voice, higher than necessary, drawing glances. "You want to destroy us, don't you? You want to humiliate me in front of everyone? This is revenge because I said you didn't belong somewhere, isn't it? You're offended because you were reminded of your place." I didn't deny that sentence. I just looked at her and said slowly, "I didn't come here to argue. I came to end a false story." Her mother jumped in, pointing at me, her voice thick with disdain. "You act like a victim. You give money and expect worship. Decent men don't do that." Someone in the circle let out a short laugh, not amused. An older man said, "Decency isn't taking someone's money year after year and then calling them controlling." The air grew heavy. The organizers started paying attention. Someone stepped over and asked what was happening. My daughter-in-law tried to speak, but others were already handing envelopes to that person. They skimmed quickly, eyes widening, then fell silent. I opened my briefcase and took out the old pen. I didn't raise it like a dramatic symbol. I simply placed it on the materials table beside the envelopes. That small motion calmed me strangely. It felt like setting a piece of my life back where it belonged, no longer holding it to sign things I was never allowed to question. I spoke, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "From now on, any financial or legal arrangements will go through my lawyer. I'm still my son's father, but I'm no longer the sponsor of a lifestyle I'm not allowed to belong to." My son took a step forward. He looked at the pen, at the file, then at me, his eyes red. I saw him about to say something, an apology or a plea, but before he could, his wife grabbed his arm like she was pulling back something she owned. "Daniel, don't stand there. "Let's go. He's performing," she said to her husband, though her eyes stayed locked on me like an enemy. And then the real twist happened, not through a dramatic line, but on my son's face. He looked around at the people reading, at the changing expressions, then at his wife and mother-in-law. I saw the truth pass through him like a cold wind. He had lost something by choosing silence. Not just me, his ability to stand upright in his own family. He slowly pulled his arm out of his wife's grip. Slowly, but clearly. If you had been there, watching that moment, what would you call that feeling? She froze. Her mother frowned. My son said one small sentence, but in that ring of silence I heard it clearly. "Dad isn't lying." She spun on him, eyes wide. "What did you say?" He didn't answer her right away. He looked at me, his voice hoarse. "Dad, why didn't you say something sooner?" I didn't grab that question to play the victim. I just replied, "I did. You didn't listen." No one spoke after that. People looked at my daughter-in-law like a painting that had just cracked. They looked at her mother like someone familiar whose other face had been exposed. And I stood there without shouting, yet feeling my boundary clearly drawn. I left the hall before it turned into chaos. I didn't want the night to become a revenge show with applause. I walked out to the parking lot. The rain had stopped, cold air slipping through my collar. I got into my car and let out a long breath. My hands still smelled like paper. On the drive home, my phone rang. It was the lawyer. I answered. He asked if I'd done exactly what we discussed. I said yes and briefly described their reactions. He was silent for a moment, then said, "Then be prepared. If they've publicly twisted the truth, they may push this into legal territory to force you back." I watched streetlights streak across the windshield. "What kind of consequences?" I asked. He replied, "Notices from the bank, formal demands, possibly a letter shifting responsibility onto you, and you'll need to answer with exactly what you put on the table tonight." I hung up, reached home, and stepped into the quiet of my own house. I set the briefcase on the table, took off my coat, and stood for a moment in the dark living room. That night, justice wasn't a verdict yet. It was just a door opening. And on the other side of that door, I knew the legal consequences were beginning to find their way toward me. 3 weeks after that night at the hall, I received a thick envelope sent by registered mail. In the top left corner was the name of a loan servicing company. I stood right by the door and read every word like a bad weather forecast. Not surprised, just cold. Inside was a late notice, the accumulated balance, and a bold line about possible escalation to recovery proceedings if payment wasn't made within a short window. Most striking was the name listed as secondary responsible party. My name. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe, listening to the clock tick inside the house. It had been a long time since something felt so clear and so absurd at the same time. I was responsible, but the house wasn't mine. I didn't call my son. I called the lawyer and sent photos of all the documents. He replied quickly, told me not to sign anything new, not to discuss things by phone with the other side, and to brace myself for the next step. "They'll try to pressure you with language," he said. "When language doesn't work, they'll use emotion." That evening it was colder than usual. I was in the kitchen reheating soup when the doorbell rang. Not a light press, a long press, then another, like the person outside didn't know when to stop. I checked the peephole. My son stood there alone, no wife, no mother-in-law. He looked hollowed out, hair uncombed, jacket wrinkled. He was staring down at the porch floor, hands in his pockets, like an oversized child practicing an apology without finding the words. I opened the door, still standing in the doorway, not inviting him in immediately. "Dad," he said hoarsely, I need to talk." I looked straight at him. "Come in." He stepped inside slowly like he was afraid of dirtying my floor. He looked around the living room at the freshly painted walls, the lamp I'd just replaced the bulb in, The bookshelf wiped clean. Small things, but to him they were unfamiliar. My house being cared for with my money, not drained to feed someone else's dream. He sat on the edge of the chair, not daring to lean back. I poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of him. "Our house," he began, then stopped. "The bank sent a letter. They threatened to push it." "I got a letter too," I said. He closed his eyes for a second, then opened them. "I didn't know your name was on it like that, I swear. My wife said it was just a formality because you'd helped before. I didn't think it turned into responsibility." I didn't argue over the words "didn't think." I just asked, "What did you sign without reading?" He stiffened. I signed because they said it had to be quick. My mother-in-law said if we didn't sign, we'd miss a good rate. I wanted things to be peaceful." I nodded slightly, like confirming something I'd known for a long time. "So you signed to keep the peace in someone else's house?" He lowered his head. No tears, just a neck bending under weight. After a moment he said very softly, "Dad, I was wrong." 2 simple words. I knew how much pride and fear he had to push through to say them. I didn't grab them to win. I let them sit between us like an object finally set down. "Dad," he continued, "I came to ask you to help again, just for a while, just until I can get things sorted. I'll pay you back. I'll do everything." I looked at his glass of water. The water was clear, but his slight trembling made the surface ripple. I spoke slowly, not loud, not sharp. "No." He looked up sharply, eyes red but dry. "What did you say?" "No," I repeated. "I'm not going back to that role anymore." In that moment I saw what I had always avoided before. The feeling of cutting a cord that once kept my son and me close, but also tied me to something pretending to be a family. I didn't like the feeling. It wasn't satisfying in any triumphant way. It was like pulling out a thorn that had been embedded too long. Painful, but clean. My son took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Do you want me to lose the house?" I shook my head. "I don't want that. But I also can't keep paying to hold on to a house I don't have the right to step into." He sat there in silence. After a long while, he asked, "So what do you want me to do?" "Stand on your own," I said. "Sell the house if you have to. Find a smaller place. Redo your budget. Talk to your wife like a husband who knows how to protect boundaries. You're a grown man." He bit his lip. "I'm scared." "So am I," I said, and that was one of the rare times I allowed myself to say it plainly. "I'm scared of losing you. I'm scared you'll hate me. I'm scared people will say I'm cruel. But I've already lost too much because of fear." He looked at me as if he were hearing his father talk about fear without pretending to be tough for the first time. In that moment, I saw myself when I was younger, working day and night, believing that giving enough money meant giving enough love, believing silence was peace. A man who thought he was building a home, only to realize he had been carrying bricks so someone else could decorate. My son said, his voice unsteady, "I let them talk about you like that. I let them write it. That's enough," I interrupted gently. "It's late, but late doesn't mean it's over." He looked up. "What do you mean, over?" "I can forgive," I said, "but I'm not turning back. Forgiveness is for me to keep living, not for everything to go back to the way it was." He let out a breath, deflated. "Do you still want to see me?" I looked at him for a moment. "I'm still your father," I said. "I want to see you. But if you want me in your life, you have to bring me in with respect, not with need for money." Oh, he nodded slowly. "I understand." I stood up and went into the kitchen, picked up a small sheet of paper from the table. a receipt for repairing the porch roof, and a list of materials. I showed it to him. I'm fixing my house. Little by little. Nothing grand. But I want to live honestly with what I still have. He looked at the paper, then at the room. Your house? Oh, it feels warm. Because I'm not paying any more to buy acceptance, I said. My son stood up. He walked to the door, stopped, turned his back to me for a moment as if he wanted to say something else. In the end, he only said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I didn't answer with a lecture. I just nodded. Go home. Do what you need to do. When the door closed, the house was quiet as before, but no longer hollow like on previous nights. I stood in the hallway, looking at the porch light shining on the steps I had just swept clean. A question hung in the air, one I didn't force myself to answer yet. Would my son be brave enough to stand on the right side, or would he choose false peace again? I turned off the living room light and headed toward the bedroom. There was no victorious cheer in my head, only a quiet feeling, like someone who had just set down a heavy load and wasn't used to lighter shoulders yet. The chance for reconciliation was still there, but it was no longer in the hands of my money. It was in my son's choice, starting tomorrow. I began to slow my life down in a very ordinary way. There was no grand awakening moment, just that every morning I woke up a little earlier, brewed coffee, opened the window to let light fill the living room. I fixed things around the house that had always been postponed because the money should go to my son. A small crack in the wall got patched. A yellow bulb was replaced with a softer light. These small tasks didn't turn me into someone else, but they reminded me that this house was still a place where I had the right to decide. Some afternoons I walked around the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces again. There were no longer those awkward, pitying looks like after the night at the hall. People didn't ask much anymore. The online story eventually slid down the feed, making room for newer news. I didn't feel like I had won. I just felt like I had stepped out of a role I'd played for too long, the role of a father who had to prove love through transfers and silence. One time, while trimming the hedge in front of the house, I stopped because my arms were tired. I sat down on the steps and looked at my calloused hands. I thought about family, about what that word had meant to me before. Family used to be a place I had to buy my way into with constant sacrifice. If I didn't pay, didn't carry the load, didn't endure, I was afraid I'd be pushed to the edge. Now I understood something simple that had cost me a lot to learn. Family is not a club, and love should not be an unspoken contract. I had reclaimed justice for myself in the way I could. Not with shouting, not with gloating, just by placing the truth where it belonged and standing upright. But at the same time, I also lost an illusion I had held on to tightly. The illusion that if I gave enough and endured enough, people would naturally treat me with respect. When that illusion fell, it didn't shatter loudly. It fell very quietly, leaving a space I didn't know how to fill at first. There are losses that can't be recovered. Dinners I never fully enjoyed because I was worrying about money. Times I stood outside conversations to keep the peace and told myself that's what being an adult meant. Moments when I chose silence instead of saying what needed to be said. I can't go back and fix all of that, but I can stop creating new losses. My son still texts sometimes. Not often, not long messages. Sometimes just a question about my health or a picture of my grandchild's drawing from school. I reply just enough. Not cold, but not chasing either. I let the relationship have room to breathe, the way you let a wound air out so it doesn't get infected. I don't know what the future will be like. I only know that right now, I'm no longer trading my peace for fragile hope. If there is one thing I could leave you after this story, it wouldn't be some grand piece of advice. It would simply be the right to set boundaries, the right to say enough without having to hate anyone, the right to love without erasing yourself. Boundaries don't make you a bad person. They just let others know where they stand in your life. I also want to be clear about one thing. The story you've just heard is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences. It's told to invite reflection, to touch emotions you may have passed through yourself, not to encourage anyone to copy specific actions from it. Every family, every situation is different, and there is no single formula for all. I don't expect you to agree with me on every point. You might think I was too rigid. You might feel I should have compromised more. I respect those views. The only thing I hope is that when the story closes, you ask yourself one small question. Right now, in your own family or relationships, where are you standing? Are you sitting in your own chair, or are you standing off to the side because you're afraid of inconveniencing others? If you stayed to listen all the way to the end, I'm truly grateful. Your listening isn't something automatic. It's time, attention, a piece of your life you gave to this story. If you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from, or a very short thought the story brought up for you. Sometimes writing just one line is enough to feel a little lighter. If you feel this story has value, a like or a subscription isn't just a number. To me, it's like a nod, a quiet form of companionship. And if you turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos, I see that as us agreeing to meet again. No noise, just sincerity. That evening, after turning off all the lights, I pulled a new chair into the middle of the living room. It wasn't expensive, just sturdy and comfortable enough. I sat down, leaned back, and listened to the wind outside the window. No one told me to stand up. No one reminded me where my place was. And in that very quiet moment, I knew that at last I had found my seat.